Hello, welcome to the lecture series Mobility Analysis and Planning for Human-Scale Cities. And this is organized by the Mobility Lab, University of Tartu. My name is Siiri Silm and I'm Associate Professor of Human Geography. And together here physically with me is Age Poom, Associate Professor in Urban Environment, Martin Haamer, Junior Researcher in Transport Studies, and Master students. And today's lecture is given by Kay Axhausen, and he's a Professor Emeritus of Transport Planning at Eidgenössische Technische Hochschule, ETH Zürich. And before he worked at Leopold-Franzens Universität, Innsbruck, Imperial College London and University of Oxford, and he has been involved in measurement and modeling of travel behavior for the past 40 years, contributing especially to the literature on the stated preferences, micro-simulations of travel behavior, accessibility, valuation of travel time and its components, and parking behavior, activity scheduling, social networks, and travel diary data collection, including GPS tracking. And his current work focuses on the e-bike city project, which is today's lecture is also, he talks about this transport planning dilemma and is the e-bike city possibility. And after this lecture, we have the time for discussions, and if you in online have questions, then please post your questions to the chat. And now I give this screen to Kay Axhausen. Here you are. You are very welcome to give the lecture.
Happy to join you and to talk about this ongoing work. Okay, the dilemma, and I will talk about that later and then try to explain what we might be able to do. I think the first question we have to ask ourselves, where do we go now that we have reached the 1.5 increase in temperatures over the pre-industrial norm? And all of you know that we are happily continue to spew out CO2 and other greenhouse gases, so it's likely that these temperature increases will continue. I'm not a physicist, I'm not a climatologist, so I will not tell you all the details. I think you are well aware of them. And I only will talk about the transport component in this, which makes up about 25 to 30% of all greenhouse gases emitted. Now, in this issue, in this situation, we need ideas where we want to go. And the question in particular is, can academics make a contribution to such visions which become a guide and a guideline for how to act and what to change? And this is a really important question because we have to assume that politics stays with business as usual. Normally, politics doesn't have the time to think about grand new visions. So let's see what the steps are we have to overcome to make a vision a reality. When we think about it, academics sometimes overreach and believe that, oh, just putting out the new idea is enough. But no, the idea is just the very first step. If you think about algorithms or objects, we might do that in the lab as a PhD, as a designer of an object. But that very first implementation of the idea is not even a prototype. We are just the first coder, and we can't really make it stable enough, detailed enough to make it really practical. So we need, after the first coder, we need a software engineer or a team in a factory which takes the idea, takes the objects, and makes it into a product which is ready for serial or large-scale implementation application. But even then, the project is there, or the code is there, but nobody's going to buy it or use it. So you need transmission into practice. And let's say for an algorithm, it's normally the consultant who then takes on the new code, the new idea, and applies it. Or it's the firm which sells it. But even then, it's not really out in the market. And in particular, in the transportation domain, where we have a very particular market, which is dominated by public entities to implement our ideas. And there, the consultant will need to convince the advisor to the executive that his idea, his algorithm, his results are really the relevant ones. And then if the advisor is convinced, the advisor has to convince the executive who finally takes the decision to implement an idea. Now, in particular situations, the executive is only shaping the decisions, but is not really the ultimate decision maker. In the Swiss context in which we work with the e-bike city, it's clear that the final decision on any new urban vision will be taken by the voters in a referendum. So in the end, we have to convince 51%, or actually better, given the significance of the changes, 65% of the voters to adopt this. And when you look at this sequence, you understand why your first idea will take decades to become reality in many cases. Okay. Now, having said that, let me talk about what I want to talk about and the e-bike city. Now, so what is the dilemma we face today? The dilemma we face today is that our objectives aren't consistent with what we are doing. Let's look backwards. When you look at Switzerland in 1950, you can distort the travel times you had in 1950 to produce this map. In a geography department, I probably don't have to explain this. This map has been reshaped so that the distances you read in the map are now travel times, not kilometers. See the scale at the bottom left. So that was Switzerland in 1950. And we did this for the year 2000, and it's the same scale. And you can see we shrunk Switzerland successfully. And that is really the result of all the investment in the motorway system. This is just the road side, and in buying all the cars with which to travel faster and more reliably. So we have shrunk Switzerland, and not only Switzerland. I think if you do this for any other country in the Western world, you will see similar results. Now, when you do this, as you also know, accessibility increases. You know the Hansen approach, or alternatively, the log-sum term of a destination choice model, you can calculate according to this formula. If you remember, or let me explain it again, what do we do? What do we argue? We argue that the utility of a transport system is by the accessibility it produces. And this accessibility, sorry, I have the German slide here, is the sum of the product of the opportunities you have at a certain location J times the impedance of getting there. And this impedance of getting there is a function of the generalized cost, Kij, from traveling from I to J. This f function is normally some function which gives a high weight to things which are close by and low weights to things which are far away, following Tobler's first law of geography. So the essential result of this is that we can produce accessibility by either increasing the number of opportunities, for example, increase the number of people living in an area, or by reducing the generalized cost of getting to them. And this applies to any other opportunity you're interested in. Now, when you do this, you can calculate this for 1950 in Switzerland and then for the year 2000. And what you can see in this comparison is that the main cities of Switzerland, which are these high peaks, Geneva, Lausanne, Bern, Basel, Zurich, remain the peaks. But in between, there has been an enormous increase in accessibility, which is due to suburbanization, but also to the expansion of the road system to everywhere, but into the mountains. Now, what are the results of that? What are the impacts of this? There are two impacts, which I want to highlight here. One impact is that we have bought more cars. But not only did we buy more cars, we bought them because they have become substantially, radically cheaper. What I show you here is a middle-class car tracked over 120 years, the price of it. And you can see for American numbers till the 1950s that the price collapsed from, in this scale, from 1,300 to only 400. It's a reduction by 70%. And then after World War II, and this is just for Switzerland, the prices reduced further from about 450 to 100. So over the last 120 years, the price of a car has effectively dropped from 1,300 to 100. And it's no surprise that we are using our money to buy them. And as you all know, you're aware of the enormous market penetration of cars in the Western world. And this is at the back. And now, if you combine this market penetration of the cars with this improvement in accessibility, it's no surprise that we are traveling more. These are numbers for person kilometers traveled from the Swiss National Travel Diary since the early 1990s. And I could have traced it further back, but I didn't do it here. And what you can see is that the ongoing improvement of accessibility through faster cars and more robust cars, plus investment in the road system, has increased the mileage we are traveling. Now, the very last microcensus obviously reflects the impact of the pandemic, but I'm sure that the currently ongoing microcensus in Switzerland will bounce back to the previous numbers. Okay, so we have a world in which we have invested heavily in making Switzerland smaller, in increasing accessibility, and we have responded to it by buying more cars and by traveling more. And that's really the dilemma. We have this higher accessibility improves, with all of that travel, improves productivity and increases social capital. What do I mean here? If you make it possible for people to travel further more easily, it is very likely that you are finding the right job for your skills, or other way around, the employers find the right people for the posts they want. And that will increase the productivity of the firm and hopefully also your salary. On the other hand, by being able to follow people and to be in contact with people, you maintain or increase your social capital, which is the other major statue and the major pillar on which a society rests. You have to be productive as a society, but you also have the social capital so that you can collaborate and work together. So that's why we continue to want to improve accessibility. Now, obviously, you can argue about marginal effects, but nevertheless, it is one of the things we can do. Now, unfortunately, this high accessibility or lower generalized costs have impacts as well. They make car ownership more attractive. They increase transport demand, as I showed. And as long as we are using the vehicles we do use, it increases greenhouse gas emissions and increases congestion, because building roads is slower than increasing travel demand. It also encourages working from home, and with working from home, it reduces the willingness of the travelers to commit themselves to a season ticket, and therefore also improves and increases car ownership. And finally, it obviously invites sprawl, which in Switzerland is discouraged. The Swiss actually have voted on the law to reduce the sprawl in the country. Now, we have two objectives which we want to reconcile. We want to improve productivity, we want to increase our social capital, but we also want to reduce all the other factors on the bottom, in particular the greenhouse gas emissions. And as I mentioned, it's about 30%, 25 to 30%. And this is one of the main things we could do if we want to get to a zero emission future. Okay. Let's go back to this idea of a vision. I think politics and the voters are driven by ideas they have in their mind about how the world should be, and therefore are willing to approve and follow ideas which gets them closer to that vision. And I will just go back to some of the past visions, which I think have been driving our spatial and temporal and transfer policy. One of the most important ones was Le Corbusier's idea of the city radieuse. This idea that you're able to put people into modern, clean, sunny, and pleasant high-rises. And he suggested to do that for Paris and for any other city willing to do that. And he was a true radical. He even put a little airport between the towers, and he connected them with 10-lane of 12-lane motorways. Now, obviously, nothing has been built exactly like it, but there have been other scaled down and maybe cheaper versions of it everywhere around the world. And if you travel to East Asia, and I guess if you travel around the former Soviet Union, you will see the scaled down versions frequently. The other big vision was Usonia, Frank Lloyd Wright's idea that every American household should live in a 1-acre lot with a single family home and 2 cars and a garden. And obviously all of these then be connected with roads, and many roads. This is the other big vision which has been built with abandon. Suburbia is everywhere. Now, a bit closer to my home, after the war in Germany, they came up with the idea of a city ready for the car, autogerechte Stadt. And for that purpose, they suggested that we build motorways. You see the highway on the lower right, and providing tree-like networks to all the suburban homes. Now, these networks have been built in conjunction with suburbia everywhere, and they have their inherent problems, but that's not really the issue. But this vision of a good life on a large lot with your own car and your own home is still extremely powerful. And behind this powerful vision is obviously the idea of the motorway, the idea that we can build a facility which is so large that there will never be congestion. And obviously, they will always be sunlit and empty. Now, we all know by now that they won't be empty, and they certainly will never always be sunlit. But this idea, this image, is still in the back of the mind of the voters and the politicians, which ask for more motorways. They are not talking about the reality, they're talking about this idea. Similarly, this is a vision which was developed in 1960s England by Buchanan and his team. They were given the task to address and find solutions for urban congestion in England. They could look at everything but road pricing, because road pricing was dealt with by a parallel project under the leadership of Reuben Smead at University College. And so Buchanan came up with the idea which is one still going strong and still being proposed, of just lifting the pedestrians and their stores up one level and provide the ground floor for cars. This book has been extremely powerful because it was published as a mass market paperback by Penguin. And this is why you can still buy this pretty cheaply secondhand. Whereas the Smead report on road pricing has disappeared. You probably might find it in your library, but I don't think so. So there's another vision, and people are still asking for it. There's still these suggestions, or else things of Masdar, which is now 10, 15 years old idea of a sustainable city somewhere in the Gulf. They also suggested, let's put the cars on the ground floor and put the people up on the first floor. Okay. Now, we do have a couple of problems in all of this. And one is that for existing cities, we are bound by the networks they have. Two of the PhD students at the Institute in Zurich did an enormously large empirical exercise in which they estimated what is called a macroscopic fundamental diagram, which is a link between density and flow and speeds. And they were able to show that the parameters of these fundamental diagrams, and therefore the capacity of the roads, of the whole network, is driven by the junction density, by the lane miles, between the centrality as a measure of the chance of gridlock, and by how many buses are driving on those roads. And as you can see, these functions, these variables are very difficult to change. Junction density, lane miles, and the centrality are very expensive to change in an existing city. Okay, now, what visions are now being discussed? What are we doing? It's not as if academics aren't doing things and aren't putting forward ideas. And I want to look at some of them which are currently suggested and maybe highlight one or two of their difficulties embedded in them. Okay. One of the first one is to say, okay, let's manage and coordinate what we have. So this is actually a vision which says, okay, let's do with what we have. So it's not about expansion, but it's about providing for those who do travel a decent environment and a decent experience. And obviously, the key idea here is what is called mobility pricing in various forms. Idea is to say, okay, look, we have a certain network and we will make sure that there is no congestion when you travel. But to do that, we have to charge you when you travel. Now, what would we like to charge you for? And if you ask an economist or a transport planner, he or she will come back with that list of things they would like to do. The first thing is to charge you a fee to have the network at all. This would normally be a tax on the car you own. And then you'd be charged for every kilometer you travel, i.e., just to reflect that the car use destroys the road in due time. Then you'd be charged so that you avoid congested time, so that you are not traveling when everybody else wants to travel. And if you do want to travel when everyone wants to travel, you have to pay a high fee. You'd be charged for parking, and it would be demand responsive so that there is never a parking surge. You would be charged for the greenhouse gases you produce, and you would charge for any other local emissions you're producing, soot and everything else which a car produces. And if you look at this list, it is pretty obvious that this is a non-starter politically. There's no country in the world or no city in the world which has adopted all of these taxes in full. Singapore comes closest, but not even Singapore is there. Okay, so maybe that's a non-starter. The second thing, which is currently being discussed, is coordinate public transport better and coordinate it across all modes which are potentially shared, from taxis to bicycles, to cars and buses or pooling services. You can do a lot there, and I think we should try to push ahead with this. But we have to remember that there are limits to what we can achieve with it. It's not going to solve all problems. And to visualize that, we have done an exercise. We had done a very large GPS-based study, which gave us thousands and thousands, 100,000 worth of trips. And based on those, we estimated the mode choice model, and the mode choice model then allowed us to estimate the generalized cost of travel. And then we compared the generalized cost of travel between public transport and private transport. And if you look at the solid lines, this is the ratio of the generalized cost of the car to public transport. And you can see that the car is only half the price of public transport in generalized cost terms. And that means that at best, public transport can have a market share of maybe 1/3. Now, you can say, okay, how can we reduce the generalized cost of transport for public transport use? You could essentially take out the cost for them so that people wouldn't have to pay. And one way of doing that is to give everybody a season ticket, which is the dashed lines above. But even if you give everybody a season ticket for free, so that they don't think about the cost, even then the ratio is about 1:1, which means that at best, public transport gets a market share of a bit more than 50%. Now, this is an issue because we know that private cars are producing many more CO2 emissions than people in a bus. So we have a limit there. Okay, what else? Okay, we can think automation. Yeah, but automation doesn't really help because automation has insidious effects, which we are not happy about. Let me show you. The first thing is that if you look at the expected cost of automated vehicles, and this is based on a cost study which 2 of my PhD students did to the best of their possibilities in 2016. So maybe today's the numbers are different. We saw that automated electric vehicles would be 1/3 cheaper than current ones. This is again for middle-class cars. Okay, a 1/3 reduction in cost has obviously an induced demand effect, so people will travel more. Now, if you go further and look at it in detail, you can see that for private automated vehicles, the variable costs, i.e. the cost which exists by any additional kilometer traveled, is only 1/3 of what an automated taxi would have to charge. And that means that automated cars will be massively cheaper and perceived to be cheaper by their travelers. And that means that they will generate induced demand. And there are various exercises which have been done around the world in small-scale studies, which indicate that if automated vehicles are finally in the hand of private consumers, we will see increases in travel kilometers about 50 to 60, maybe 80%. And that's obviously a horror story, given that we can't expand the road capacity quickly enough to meet that. Now, if we then look at the total effects, then let's look at the CO2 emissions. On the black bar is the current level of CO2 emissions, and the red bar is what we want to see from the transport sector. And you can see that, yes, if we switch to electric vehicles, that would be good. If you switch to today's electric vehicles, if you switch to the electric vehicles we expect, i.e. with further improved batteries, we would meet the target. Yes, but there's a couple of things which will not allow us to do that. There will be population growth, which has an impact. This is Switzerland. Then there's induced demand effects because the vehicles are cheaper, both electric vehicles and then autonomous vehicles. And that means that the emissions we produce is well above the target we wanted to meet. So the question becomes, how can we close this gap? What can we do? Now, what is currently being discussed is really a solution only for urban areas, because we still haven't found a way, and it's very hard to find a way, to get the car out of suburbia. Maybe suburbia we can manage, but certainly not the farther reaches of suburbia, exurbia, or the rural areas. So what is being discussed for urban areas are cities which are car-free or massively reduced car ownership. And it comes in various different ways and names. There's the 15-minute city, there's a net zero city. And we, in the project in Zurich, want to suggest an idea which is called the e-bike city. Okay. Why e-bike? Actually, we shouldn't label it e-bike city, it should be e-bike, bike, public transport, walking city, but it's too long a term and not catchy enough. What is an e-bike city in our imagination? An e-bike city is a city in which we think the city from the e-bike and transit. So we are not thinking first about the car, but we are thinking first about the bike and transit. Then we suggest that 50% of the road space as it currently exists is reallocated to e-bikes, bikes, and walking where necessary. So 50%, which is massive, because in Zurich, for example, the infrastructure for bikes has about 13% of the road space. So we would quintuple it, so massive change. We would integrate shared services so that we can cope with large demands and large demand variations. And finally, and that is really one of the key things, we maintain accessibility levels for all. i.e., we would make sure that every address is reachable by a motorized vehicle for emergency services, for deliveries, for the moving van, so that there's no price to be paid. Now, this last demand is going to be really difficult. Okay, so this is the idea. Now, what have we done? We have teamed up. It's a group of 7-8 professors. We have 10, 15 PhDs running to look at different elements and aspects of this vision. And one of my students has developed software to allow you to redesign your city quickly so that you don't have to do it by hand, but that you have supported. And he's basing it essentially on OSM data. And it's very effective software, which he has made available online. And we are looking at all the other things. So what is the behavioral change we would expect? What are the expected life cycle assessment costs? What are the costs of actually building this? What are the safety aspects, and on and on? And what are the public acceptance of an idea like that? So this project has come up with first implementation in the sense that we have designed it. We haven't really changed Zurich or any other city yet, but at least we wanted to give the citizens and the decision makers an idea how that city might look and feel. And to do that, we redesigned and visualized this new design for Zurich. This is a this is a radial street leading out of Zurich. And you can see here what we have done. The red areas are the new two-way bike lanes. And you can see that in this road, there's only one lane for cars left on the left. And there's obviously the space for public transport, which we left intact. We didn't change anything there because public transport is still the other core of the network. So this is how an e-bike city might look like in Zurich. This is a different street, but now from the perspective of the cyclist, to give you an idea how it would feel to live in that city, to cycle in that city. And to continue on this line of making it understandable for people, we have also developed a small video, which I'll show you now.
Climate change may be the greatest challenge of the 21st century. In Switzerland, transportation produces 41% of CO2 emissions from energy combustion, which is more than in the USA and across the European Union. Traffic jams are commonplace, and by 2050, populations in Swiss cities should grow by another 30%. Traffic simulations by researchers at ETH Zurich show that there is a solution to increase the capacity of streets and reduce emissions. Reallocating more street space for sustainable modes can improve safety, efficiency, access, and sustainability in a way that everyone's mobility needs are met. Decarbonizing transportation while improving the freedom of travel requires integration of micromobility and public transportation. By transforming streets, we can strengthen public transportation and micromobility and provide safer and more attractive spaces for pedestrians. Emergency and delivery vehicles, as well as mobility vans and tradespeople, will have access to all buildings through a parking reservation system. Better access to wider, separated bike lanes will increase safety and convenience for all ages and abilities. Children could enjoy cycling to school safely. Increased bike parking and more publicly shared micromobility would provide last-mile connections for commuters and visitors. More space designated for micromobility means people would benefit from less crashes, reduced stress, and improved health and well-being. Based on research, redesigning streets is a quick and cost-effective solution that would work if implemented. People can regain autonomy and enjoy the freedom of movement without owning a car. By combining public transport and micromobility, we occupy less street space and make the city more livable for everyone while achieving emissions goals for transportation.
Good. Yeah. Now, this gives you an idea of how it might look like. But this question still is, we would have to convince the voters that this is an idea which they want to adopt and which they want to commit to. And so we have to provide first assessments, what the change would bring. Now, there's various levels at which we have done this assessment. Lucas Ballo has looked in particular at the changes in distances traveled and expectations. And a second student, Lucas Meyer de Freitas, has looked at mode choice. And I want to show you these results, which are first results and haven't really been peer reviewed yet, but they might give you an idea of what we would expect. So what would you do? We set up a MATSIM model. It's an agent-based model, which implies a correlation algorithm to find the equilibrium, which has been developed at TU Berlin and at ETH over the last 2 decades for Zurich and its surroundings. MATSIM is open source, and I guess maybe 1 or 2 of you have used it already or know about it, and it's available to everyone. And finally, the system allows you to model mode choice, destination route choice, and on-demand services. In this particular implementation, Lucas looked at mode choice in particular. What area did he look at? He looked at Zurich. This is the black dot in the middle, and its surroundings. These are all the municipalities where at least 10% of the residents commute to Zurich for work. So he looked at a relatively large area, which has about 1.5 million people. He modeled the road system, he modeled the public transport system to look at that. He then undertook a stated choice experiment. In this stated choice experiment, he asked people about their current travel, then showed them scenarios in which he implemented the e-bike city, and he showed them visual implementations of that. So that wasn't just text on a page, but images similar to the ones I showed you before. When you do this, when you implement this network, and he based this network on work by Lucas Ballo, who had done a design for the whole city, you get, first of all, a massive change in travel times for the car drivers. And this is box plots for all the OD pairs in the city. And you can see that on average, in the morning peak, you get a 1.80% increase in travel time. You get the same thing in the afternoon peak. In the morning, in between, it's not as massive. And in the evening, it's still very substantial. So you have a massive deterioration as far as the car drivers are concerned. And if you combine these numbers with the estimates from his mode choice model, you get the following changes. Sorry. You can see that the car, this is now in kilometers traveled, get a substantial reduction in the mode choice for cars. And these are probably the numbers we need to achieve our CO2 emission goals. Public transport increases substantially, which is no surprise given that this is a pretty large area in which some people will say, no, I can't travel by bike all of these distances. And that long distance public transport obviously then produces lots of person kilometers traveled. But you can also see very large increases in bike use. And we distinguish between normal bikes, e-bikes, and S-pedelecs, which in Switzerland are allowed to travel up to 45 kilometers an hour. Walking would go down a bit because biking becomes more attractive. Now, we finally are where we want to be. These numbers here, which are shown here, these 12, 16, 17% of all the passenger kilometers traveled, is more cycling than is normal in Holland, which is normally the prime comparison, because this is in person kilometers traveled. Lucas hasn't provided yet the numbers in terms of trips, but the trip numbers are also higher than you would expect in the Netherlands. So yes, you can achieve the goals, but you would have to make a massive change. And we haven't looked at the accessibilities in detail, and first results show that it would be okay, but not that we would completely maintain current levels. So yes, you can achieve the goals, but you have to be willing to make a massive redesign. And then we only looked at mode choice, but there are other things. How would people adapt their activity schedules? How would they integrate working from home? How would they integrate e-shopping into this new world? And can we do this assessment based on current mode choice models, or how reliable are SP models to allow us to guide us into the future? And then one question which we have and which we need to look at, how do you impact the mobility impaired? And there we would have to really know where they live, who they are, and how much their impairment is. So these are research questions which are still outstanding. And then we have to ask ourselves, who would be winners and losers? Because if we want to win an election campaign, this is the first question you have to ask. You would argue that a world which meets its CO2 targets obviously is a win for the future generations. but future generations don't vote. You would argue that current and future cyclists would be winners. Obviously, they would have more space, they would travel more safely, they could travel faster because the infrastructure is better. The same applies to pedestrians. Public transport users would also win because you would assume that this occasion is used to redesign the networks, so we would have services which would have fewer stops and therefore be faster and have more services so that the waiting times for the next bus or the next tram becomes lower. And you would expect that the urban residents would win because this world is more attractive, and you would assume that the demand for housing in the city continues to grow. Okay, these are the winners. The mobility impaired, this is obviously unclear because we haven't really looked in detail at them, but one is afraid that they might lose. Now, clearly, suburban commuters probably will lose because they will face longer travel times. And that would require them to make further changes in their world, adopting working from home where they can, moving. The firms might redistribute their employment centers. We don't know yet. Urban car users would clearly say they lose because they have much higher, longer distances in terms of their travel times. And finally, urban consumers might be concerned that these changes will increase their prices. Now, this is one of the most difficult issues because there's so much change in the shopping area that we don't really know what's going to happen anyway. But in an election campaign, we would have to deal with that and have to detail what we would expect will happen. Okay. With that, I'm going to close. First here, this is the whole team, both the PIs and the researchers who have done the work and the various people who have coordinated and looked at the access to the results. And finally, I show you the various sources in which you can look for more details on the project, as well as on the results of the project. And with that, I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Kai. I think it was like a really interesting presentation and the study that you have done. And then it's, I think I would start for the first, my question that, as you said at the beginning of this presentation, that there was a lot of this city planning dreams in the past, and there wasn't went as they hoped. And what do you think that how is your dream about this city e-bike city goes? That is it like I don't know how many years it would be like getting like half of this done, or some not to say the percentages, but how I think you hope that it will get this, but you be like realistic that how it will go.
Yeah. Now, first, I would like to confirm that we indeed managed to maintain the accessibility levels. And that's one question which we haven't really looked enough at. So, okay, assuming that we are able to maintain the accessibility levels, we would then have to look at the question whether this is true for all weather situations and what needs to be done to maintain these levels also for ugly weather. Okay, now assume that we can show that and assume that we can win the voters for it. I think that the implementation is actually going to be relatively fast, because in the first instance, we are not suggesting reconstruction. There are the intersections which there has to be some civil engineering works to be done there, but in total, the amount of work is relatively small. So if we can get a positive approval, then the implementation could be very fast. Very fast when you think how long it takes us to build other things, because some of the other alternatives obviously say, oh, let's build many, many more undergrounds. But underground systems, certainly in the Western world, take 10 to 20 years before you have finished one line. Never mind providing the capacity for a whole city. And even in China, which is built extremely fast, I think Beijing needed 10 to 15 years to build its now massive system. So I think the e-bike city is a relatively fast approach to the problem, because the other change which would happen, which we would hope would happen, is that certainly the urban residents start to reconsider whether they really truly need cars. They could get rid of their cars within the lifetime of a car, which is normally 10 years, and they would have to shift to cycling. So I think if a city were to decide to go forward, they could go forward relatively fast, and the residents could adapt their behavior or change their behavior pretty quickly as well.
Do you have discussion about this politicians, or who have this city to how they are able to take to this project, or the ideas to do based on doing the decision based on this?
Okay. Now, I think clearly the team is very influenced by the context in which we are working. Because in Switzerland, as you might realize, any decision of that scale has to be voted upon in a referendum. So the first thing which, if somebody wanted to put this forward, he or she would need to do, he would need to put together a referendum committee to say, okay, we want to put this forward. Then you would have to collect, I think in Zurich, about 10,000 signatures to put it on the vote. And then you would have to run an election campaign to convince the residents that this is a good idea. That would be one way. In Swiss context, the city executive could also put it to a vote if it wanted to, but we aren't there yet. I think the main hurdles at this point is that we have committed ourselves so strongly to the car that anything which is putting an extra burden on the car in this time, travel times, is an unpopular idea. I think in Switzerland, you have about 650 cars per 1,000 inhabitants. They would have to vote against their car. And you have to remember, the car is the most expensive consumer good you're ever going to buy, unless you buy a house. And it's obviously very hard to convince people that they might want to change that. Lucas, in his mode choice work, was able to show that the people who have bought small and cheap cars are much more willing to change and switch to cycling than people who have bought expensive cars. These people have done more than just bought a vehicle. They bought an expression of themselves. And for them to vote for an e-bike city would be an enormous jump. Now, not everybody has expensive cars, but there is a big hurdle there.
Yeah, thank you. And now I give the floor also to students to ask. Yeah.
Yeah. All the ideas that historically have wanted to include cars have been radical. The city of Le Corbusier and others. And my question is this, do we need, are radical ideas the only way for increasing public transit or e-bikes? Because nowadays the radical idea seems are the ones that want to limit the use of car. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We have and are continuing investing in public transport. But we can see that with public transport, there is a certain limit to what we can achieve. I showed you these figures about the generalized cost curves. There are inherent discomfort about public transport. You have to go to stop. You have to wait for it to arrive. You might have to change. You are in a potentially crowded vehicle, and on. So public transport has systematic difficulties, which you can't overcome. And even the best way, which is the idea that everybody sits in an automated vehicle, automated taxi, doesn't really fully solve the problem. Just putting ourselves from a private car into an automated taxi doesn't change anything in terms of congestion. It doesn't change anything in terms of CO2 emissions. So we have limits what we can achieve. And the e-bike city is the idea that we can provide an alternative which is both healthier, because the physical exercise we would get is clearly helping us. It would be safer because the people are not hurting each other as much if they crash into one another, and so on. So I do believe if we really want to go forward, radical ideas are needed, because some of the other ideas, like, okay, provide underground tunnels for everybody, like Elon Musk wants to do, no, it will not solve the problem.
More questions here? Okay.
I can ask.
Okay, Martin.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I was wondering, in the context of the e-bike city, have you envisioned that most of the bicycles would be privately owned e-bikes, or would they be part of a larger citywide sharing system and people would opt to use public e-bikes instead of having their own?
At this point, we looked at privately owned e-bikes. And the reason to do that is the life cycle cost of shared e-bikes. Another student, Daniel Reck, did a study based on real data from Zurich on the CO2 impact of e-bikes, shared and non-shared. And at that point of time, for that fleet of e-bikes, the impact of bike sharing was negative. And it has to do with the fact that the e-bikes need to be repositioned, and the repositioning plus the life cycle costs of the e-bikes. Now, this was now nearly 10 years ago, and maybe the shared e-bikes have become much better in their life cycle costs. Then, yes, you would want to have a shared system as well as private ones. But I don't envisage a future where everything will be shared.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Kai, for this very, very interesting and very structured talk and the flow of thought. This kind of an e-bike city is certainly something that we really want to reach. Like one of my concerns has been how to connect the existing suburbia with this very livable city, or this like e-bike city where we can actually use those sustainable modes.
Yeah.
And this question, in a way, it has several dimensions. So first, if we have this improved city or urban space, you also said that the property prices might increase, which also means that living in such urban areas becomes more expensive, which might create additional demand for suburban living because it might be more cheaper there. But it also might lead to transport poverty. So people who can't live in the urban space, they still might be very dependent on their private cars, and owning private car in such a system might be very expensive. So it might create such kind of a tensions, suburban and urban tensions in actually in access to daily amenities, to workplaces, etc. So one of those dimensions is how to connect those suburban areas to urban opportunities in an e-bike city concept, so that it does not create like social impact on existing suburban population.
Thank you. This is a very good point, and we haven't had the time and chance to look at that in the detail we want. Now, I can't give you any detailed and founded results, but my first assessment would be that suburbia, certainly in the Swiss context, is very well connected by public transport. So you have S-Bahnen and the matching timetables. So in that part of suburbia, which is currently reachable and well reachable by public transport, the impact of the e-bike city wouldn't really change much. It would probably put more people who are currently driving in the city, because they still have parking in the city, on the buses and the trains. Now, the truly problem are people living in exurbia, so kind of in the far reaches of suburbia, or even in the rural areas. And for those, we haven't really looked at how we can deal and provide services for them. So that's one point. The question, what you do with either the mobility handicapped, because they have physical restrictions on how much they can move, is a point I acknowledge. We need to look at that. And then clearly, for the people who are cash poor and live in suburbia, it's going to be, we really have to find solutions what to do and how to do it. And I don't want to make suggestions because we haven't really thought about it in detail yet.
I take now some questions from online, and there's many good words about your presentation, that it was very excellent and good ideas, and you can also see in online these comments. But for questions that there is to put together two of these, that have you on this modeling tried to test it in different type of the cities, that for mountainous terrain or narrow streets, or where you can fit only the one car and don't have space for separate bike lanes. And then I think it is also related to this questions that for your this video haven't no parking spaces, that how this parking space is in this e-bike city, that how it is solved there.
Okay, thanks. These are questions about the detailed design. Now, today's talk, I didn't really show further results other than the visualizations. But if you go to the website, which I listed at the back at the end, let me show you. If you go to this website, ebikecity.ch, this is a story map, and the story map also gives you access to a map of Zurich in which the redesign are shown in detail. So you can scroll in, you can see every road you want to look at. In principle, the idea is that 50% of the road space is reallocated. But that means that, for example, in a cul-de-sac, obviously you can't do that. So there it's essentially, you're designing not bike paths, but it becomes a bicycle street, which have been put forward in the Netherlands and in Germany before. So these are roads in which the bike becomes priority, and cars have to travel at low speeds to not endanger them. And otherwise you find enough space to provide for the bikes. And the other thing is, what about parking? in the detailed design tool, which Lukas has made available, you specify how much parking you still want. Now, you obviously, the parking which is on the lots cannot be changed by the city, so these remain. On-street parking is a luxury which a city provides to its citizens, but it's not a right of the citizens to have on-street parking. And if you have to redesign the streets, yes, much on-street parking will be lost, or not lost, will be removed. But we'll make sure that there is enough parking for the absolute necessity which is needed. You need parking for deliveries, you need parking for other services which come to the house. And we make sure in the design tool that that parking is allocated on the streets and that it's close by, not as maybe as close as it was in the past, but it's close enough so that people can get to the addresses and service and support the household.
Thank you. And then as one more questions about this infrastructure, or what would you consider the first step of e-bike city? That what kind of infrastructure is essential? What we can do with this minimum budget?
I think the budget is the budget, but it's substantially smaller than the budget you would need, for example, to build new tram lines or new undergrounds, or alternatively build tunnels for cars. I think as we looked at it, obviously you need to repaint and you need to reallocate the street space. There is some need to remodel the junctions so that the cyclists can travel safely through them. What is priority? I think this becomes then a question of staging. How do you stage the implementation of the e-bike city for a whole city? For Zurich, we haven't really thought about what we would do. I guess we would probably start with the most dangerous and most promising links first, and then go to those areas which are a bit less critical to convert.
But to go back for this, I think the last one of the questions that, as I understood, you have modeled it based on the Zurich. But have you also the ideas to extend to other cities in Switzerland or in other countries to compare it to first for this modeling base?
Okay. What we have done, we had two students designing an e-bike city for 3 cities in Switzerland, Winterthur, Basel, and Aarau. And Lukas is now offering his services to cities which are interested, and he did work for Lucerne and for Austria, for an Austrian city. So our hope is that others will pick up the idea, and we have made the tools available online, so they're public domain, and Lukas would be more than happy to help you and support you if you're interested in that. So yes, that is on the redesign. On the modeling side, we did a bit of work for Lucerne and work for Zurich. But there, we are obviously limited to the existence of a MATSIM model or an alternative transport model to look at that. We would be more than happy to support you, but we haven't done more yet.
But which data you are basing on your model, that what is needed if you would like to use your development, that which data then it's need to be available for this city?
Okay, for SNMN, which is the tool to redesign the network, you need an OSM network. And we assume that OSM networks are available for most places around the world, obviously of different quality, but OSM is the starting point. And with that, you can start. That's for the design side. If you want to then implement a MATSIM version, you need what you need for a MATSIM model. So you need the OSM network again. You would then need the population and a description of current behavior as you normally need for a travel demand model.
Then it's like good that you have done such an open source model that can
Yes.
do also for other cities. And I think there is like coming a lot of research can do to compare the cities. If this methodology for modeling is similar, then I think this is like really good approach to develop it further.
And just to highlight, MATSIM is also open source as well. The source is matsim.org, and from there you can download MATSIM for your city.
Do we have here more questions? Or if not, then I take one question from web. There is also a question about this, that how would the real estate taxation affect development of e-bike city? There is also a little bit, brought this differences in this prices of this city, like real estates, but do you have some studies or impressions of this?
No. For the real estate, we haven't done anything, clearly, because there's no e-bike city yet implemented, so we couldn't have observed prices. I think the logic would be that if we indeed implement an e-bike city, the city would become healthier and potentially attractive. Now, this is difficult to predict because we have people who are committed to the car. They just can't think of themselves without one, and they might move out. So we might see some resorting of the population in this context, and there it's very hard to predict what is going to happen to the prices. Now, on the other hand, if we still assume that, for example, in Switzerland, the population will continue to grow, that will put pressure on urban real estate anyway. So it will become hard to distinguish what's the impact of population growth, what is the impact of the e-bike city. But on first principles, I would assume that an e-bike city, because it makes the city more attractive, will increase prices. But it will then depend on what happens simultaneously to the housing market. Will the housing market provide more affordable housing? Will the size of the apartments match the households better, in contrast to today, where you have many households which live in flats which are way too large for them? So there are many dimensions which could change. But in principle, I would assume that, yes, it will maintain the attractiveness of the urban areas.
And I think there is also coming this big topic about this segregation, that how it influences social segregation, and also in some type of cities also the different ethnicities and this minority groups. And I think this is like big topic. I don't really like to arise it like very widely here. I think
like anything which changes the city will have an impact on those dynamics. That's clear. But I wouldn't expect that it will be selective in it. Because if you say that it's selective, you assume that there's just certain people who will cycle, and that these people are then also marked by some other marker you're interested in. And I think that's a very difficult position to take, or hard to argue position to take. So we have looked at it in detail, so I can't speak from the basis of knowledge. This is just assumptions I would make.
Yeah. And the time is over today, and very big thanks for you, Kay, to this Very excellent and good idea of this on this presentation. And the next time the lecture will be at 8th of May. And then Milos Mladenovic from Aalto University speaks about lessons from spatial planning and transportation engineering master programs. See you soon.